Alright, let's go. Number 10. The lake that hid a village. The Sea of Galilee sits in the Jordan Rift Valley, a freshwater lake fed by the Jordan River and by springs along its floor. In 1989, a drought pulled its water level down by several meters, and along the exposed southwestern shore, a geologist noticed shapes in the mud that did not look like mud. The site is Ohalo II, and it turned out to be one of the best preserved hunter-gatherer camps anywhere from the last glacial maximum. Excavations ran from 1989 to 1991, and again from 1998 to 2001, led by Danny Nadel of the University of Haifa. Radiocarbon dates place the occupation between roughly 23,500 and 22,500 years ago. The camp covers more than 2,000 square meters and includes the remains of 6 oval brush huts, open-air hearths, a human grave, and refuse heaps still holding the shape of the people who filled them. What burned the village preserved it. At some point, probably only a few generations after it was built, Ohalo II caught fire. Whether by accident or intent is unknown. The charring, combined with a subsequent rise in the lake, sealed the site under fine clay and silt before oxygen or scavengers could take apart what was left. That is why a last glacial maximum campsite still has its brush walls. Most sites this old have nothing but stone and bone. This one has roofs. The botanical preservation is the reason Ohalo II keeps showing up in journals 3 decades later. More than 90,000 plant remains have been recovered from the huts and their floors, including wild barley, wild wheat, and wild oats, along with grinding stones bearing starch residues, consistent with processed cereal grain. That is thousands of years before the invention of agriculture, anywhere on Earth. Nobody is claiming these people farmed. But somebody at Ohalo II was gathering wild grass seed, grinding it, and probably baking or roasting it, deep in the depths of the coldest, driest period of the last glacial cycle. That timing is the point. In 2022, a study led by Hebrew University doctoral student Tikva Steiner, under Rivka Rabinovich and Danny Nadel, published in PLOS One, examined more than 20 xerizone animal bone fragments from the site using microwear analysis and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. The picture that emerged was not desperation, it was diversity. Gazelle, deer, hare, fox, birds, reptiles, and fish, all exploited with skill, alongside the wild grain. While ice sheets locked up water across the northern hemisphere and much of the world went hungry, the people camped on this lakeshore were eating well. The grave belongs to an adult male, laid on his side with his legs drawn up, found among the huts rather than apart from them. Whoever buried him did so inside the world he had lived in, not outside it. Today the site is submerged again. The lake refilled after the drought that revealed it, and the excavation trenches lie under several meters of the Sea of Galilee, protected from erosion and from the air that would eventually destroy the wood, the grain, and the woven plant fiber recovered from the huts. Fishermen cross the site without knowing it. Under them, in the dark and the cold and the silt, is one of the only Ice Age villages on Earth still holding its shape. And this is only the beginning. If you want to uncover more forgotten places, lost civilizations, and discoveries that completely change what we thought we knew about the past, hit subscribe now, because the next one is even harder to believe. Number 9. The technology built to survive one valley. Around 26,000 years ago, as the last glacial cycle tightened its grip on Europe, human populations across much of the continent contracted or vanished. In the river valleys of what is now southwestern France, they did neither. The evidence sits under a limestone overhang 2 kilometers from the town of Les Azes in the Dordogne, at a rock shelter called Laugerie-Haute. The shelter was first recorded in 1862 by Edouard Lartet and Henry Christie, then systematically dug from 1921 by Denny and Elie Peyroni, with excavation continuing intermittently until 1935. What makes it valuable is not any single find. It is the stratigraphy. Laugerie-Haute holds one of the longest unbroken sequences of the European Upper Paleolithic, a stack of living floors from the Aurignacian through the Solutrean to the Magdalenian sealed and preserved by the collapse of its own ceiling. In 2018, a team using new radiocarbon, dating on unheated reindeer bone fragments from Laugerie-Haute Ouest, showed the sequence there was deposited across roughly 8,500 to 10,000 years, spanning 28,000 to 19,000 years ago. That range runs directly through the coldest part of the last glacial cycle. The Vézère Valley and the country around it, from the Charente to the Dordogne, carries the densest concentration of Upper Paleolithic sites in Europe. During the last glacial maximum, this narrow band of southwestern France became the core of what archaeologists call the Solutrean Refugium, alongside the Iberian Peninsula further south. Reindeer became the dominant prey almost everywhere in the region, and osteometric studies of reindeer bones from Laugerie-Haute show that animals themselves were smaller than earlier or later populations, a signature of the environmental stress of the period. What people made here under that stress is the reason the Solutrean gets its own name in the archaeological record, rather than folding into what came before it. The Solutrean laurel leaf point is a bifacial stone blade, sometimes over 30 centimeters long, flaked so thin that light passes through the edges. It requires a level of control over pressure, flaking that nothing preceding it in Europe approaches, and very little after it matches. These were not utilitarian tools in any simple sense. Some are too large and too fragile to have been used for cutting or hunting at all. They appear to have been made to be seen. The tightening of the ice did not just concentrate population, it concentrated skill, with movement across the continent restricted and groups pressed into a smaller habitable strip. Technological knowledge that might once have diffused thinly across a wide landscape instead compounded within it, generation on generation, inside the same river valleys. Cave art at Solutrean period sites nearby, including engraved blocks at Roc de Sers and Forno du Diable, shows the same intensity applied to representation as to tool-making. The shelter at Laugerie-Haute is 35 meters deep and originally ran some 180 meters along the cliff base, though a modern house now sits over the unexcavated center of it. In 1979, it was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with the other prehistoric sites and decorated caves of the Vézère Valley. Beneath the collapsed roof blocks that sealed it 20,000 years ago, the sediment still holds, layer on layer, the sharpest stone tools the Ice Age ever produced, made by people who had nowhere left to retreat to, and made something extraordinary instead of retreating. Number 8. The cave that never really closed. On the Argolic Gulf in southeastern Greece, opposite the modern village of Kyllada, a cave opens into a limestone cliff above the water. Excavated between 1967 and 1976, Franchthi Cave holds one of the longest continuous archaeological sequences known anywhere in the world. Human use of the cave begins in the Upper Paleolithic, around 38,000 years before the Common Era, and does not stop, aside from a few short gaps, until the final Neolithic around 3000 BCE. That is roughly 35,000 years of intermittent human presence in one place. During the Upper Paleolithic, the cave was used seasonally by small groups, likely in the range of 25 to 30 people, who hunted wild ass and red deer with flint bladelets and scrapers. Its use as a campsite increased considerably after the last glacial maximum, when much of the surrounding Aegean landscape, exposed by lower sea levels, offered wider hunting ground than the flooded coast does today. The deepest sounding in the cave, Trench FCA, runs more than 11 meters into stratified living debris, the earliest homogeneous Upper Paleolithic layers, appearing around 9 meters down. The detail that turns Franchthi from a long sequence into a genuine discovery is a scatter of small black stones. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, does not occur naturally anywhere near the Argolid. Analysis has traced the Franchthi material to a single source, the island of Melos, roughly 150 kilometers away across open water, with no visible landmarks and no possibility of hugging a coastline the whole way. The obsidian appears at Franchthi in small quantities as early as the Upper Paleolithic, meaning that during or shortly after the last glacial maximum, someone was crossing open Aegean water and coming back. This is among the earliest evidence anywhere for open sea navigation by anatomically modern humans. It requires a vessel capable of the crossing, knowledge of the return route, and a reason compelling enough to risk deep water in a small craft during an era with no compass, no chart, and no rescue if the weather turned. It happens at Franchthi not as a single heroic voyage but as a recurring pattern, appearing across multiple stratified layers over thousands of years, which is the signature of routine procurement rather than a one-time accident. The record thins during the Younger Dryas, the sharp cold snap that interrupted the warming at the end of the Ice Age before resuming into the Mesolithic. In that later phase, obsidian from Melos becomes far more common in the tool assemblage, alongside the bones of large pelagic fish, likely tuna, suggesting the maritime skill that first appears in the Paleolithic layers had, by then, become an established way of life along this coast. Franchthi was named a candidate refugium decades before genetics could test the idea, purely on the strength of its stratigraphy, a place that kept being reoccupied, cycle after cycle, while surrounding regions emptied and refilled. Today, visitors reach the cave by a coastal path from Kalada and stand in an opening that people, on and off, for 35,000 years, kept finding a reason to come back to. Number 7. The grave with 2 children in it. Along the Danube in Lower Austria, where the river Krems meets the larger waterway, a construction survey in 2005 exposed a Gravettian living floor buried under more than a meter of loess, the fine wind-blown sediment that accumulates during cold, dry glacial phases. The site is Krems-Wachtberg, and the floor beneath the loess turned out to hold something almost never preserved from this period: infants. The find that made the site internationally known is a double burial. Genetic analysis, published by a team including Maria Teschler-Nicola and colleagues, identified the 2 individuals as monozygotic twins, the oldest genetically confirmed twin burial known anywhere. Isotope and micro-CT analysis of their teeth showed both were full-term. One died at or around birth. The other survived for roughly 6 to 7 weeks before dying as well. They were placed together in an oval pit, sprinkled with red ochre, and covered by a mammoth shoulder blade shaped to fit over the opening. Around them lay more than 50 beads carved from mammoth ivory, likely once strung as a necklace, along with a perforated fox incisor and perforated shells. A third infant, roughly 3 months old at death, was buried nearby in a single grave, also under a scatter of red ochre, also accompanied by an ivory pin that may have closed a wrapping of hide or fur. Radiocarbon dates place the burial layer, designated Archaeological Horizon 4.4, at approximately 26,580 radiocarbon years before present, corresponding to a calibrated age of roughly 31,000 years. That places Krems-Wachtberg early in the buildup toward the last glacial maximum, when loess was already accumulating across the Danube corridor and winters in Central Europe were growing longer and harsher by the generation. What the burial demonstrates is not survival alone. It is the persistence of ritual complexity under exactly the conditions that should have stripped it away. Newborns who die within days of birth are, in the plainest demographic terms, common and unremarkable in any pre-industrial population. At Krems-Wachtberg, they were not treated that way. Someone spent ivory ochre, a worked mammoth bone, and careful labor on 2 lives that had barely begun, in a landscape where every hour of that labor competed directly with the hours needed to find food and stay warm through a glacial's winter. A study on the grave's stratigraphy further showed that it had been reopened after the first burial, its layout modified to add the second interment, evidence of Gravettian mortuary behavior that involved not a single act, but a return. The Danube corridor through Lower Austria carried mammoth herds, and mammoth carried the raw material for nearly everything found in the grave, from the ivory beads to the shoulder blade used as a lid. The site sits within a cluster of more than a dozen Paleolithic locations around the nearby town of Stilfried, evidence of a broader population using this stretch of river valley as a base through repeated cold phases. The loess that buried the twins for 31,000 years still caps the site today, the same fine, wind-laid singelt that marks a landscape living through the leading edge of an ice age, now doing what it always did, preserving, in perfect and accidental detail, the people who lived through it. Number 6. The valley where 2 species overlap for 250,000 years, -1. In the Predates Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, a large cave opens south-facing at about 750 meters above sea level. Ralph Selecki, working with Columbia University, began excavating it in 1951. Over 4 seasons through 1960, his team dug a trench roughly 20 meters long, 6 meters wide, and 14 meters deep, and recovered the remains of 10 Neanderthals. Selecki argued some had died in rockfalls. He argued others had been deliberately buried, including one individual, Shanidar IV, associated with clumps of pollen that Selecki and the paleontologist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan interpreted in a series of papers through the 1970s as evidence of burial on a bed of wildflowers. The flower burial became one of the most cited findings in Neanderthal archaeology, reframing a species long characterized as brutish into one credited with symbolic thought and possibly grief. It was also, for decades, disputed. Recent work by a team led by Chris Hunt of Liverpool John Moores University has proposed the pollen may have been introduced by burrowing bees rather than deliberate placement. The debate over the flowers has never fully settled. What has settled the argument for Shanidar as a place of intentional Neanderthal burial is a separate individual entirely. New excavations, led by Graham Barker of the University of Cambridge beginning in 2015, located the articulated upper body of an adult Neanderthal in 2018, close to Selecki's original find spot, the first articulated Neanderthal recovered anywhere in 25 years. Published in Antiquity in 2020 by Emma Pomeroy and colleagues, the stratigraphic context showed the body had been placed in a hollow cut into a gully by running water, then further shaped by hand, dated to roughly 75,000 to 60,000 years ago. This individual, nicknamed Shanidar Z, was found within arm's reach of hearth and food debris left by living Neanderthals, meaning the group that buried their dead did so without separating the space of the living from the space of the dead. Skeletal analysis of an earlier individual, Shanidar I, showed a partly withered right arm, deafness, and evidence of a healed skull fracture, likely causing partial blindness, sustained many years before death. He lived a long time carrying those injuries. That is not possible without other people bringing him food and looking out for him. The reason this valley belongs on a list of refuges, rather than simply a list of burials, is what came after the Neanderthals. Later excavation at Shanidar also identified the Baradostian, a regional Upper Paleolithic industry associated with the Zagros Aurignacian, evidence that anatomically modern humans occupied this same cave once the Neanderthal population it had sheltered was gone. Across roughly 250,000 years, spanning multiple glacial cycles, this cave in the Zagros foothills provided consistent shelter, water, and access to game to at least 2 human species in succession. One of those species, in the end, did not survive to see the cave used by the other. Excavation continues at Shanidar today, more than 70 years after Selecki's first trench. Visitor traffic from the region's roughly 8 million annual tourists has made it one of Iraqi Kurdistan's most recognized heritage sites. Underneath the modern walkways, the gully that held Shanidar Z is still being worked, sediment layer by sediment layer, 60,000 years deep. Number 5. The bed that predates the species using it by nothing at all. In the Lubombo Mountains, straddling the modern border between South Africa and Eswatini, a rock shelter holds one of the longest and most continuous archaeological sequences anywhere in Africa. Border Cave preserves evidence of human occupation, intermittent but recurring, from roughly 227,000 years ago to as recently as 1,000 years ago. That range covers nearly the entire existence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens as a species. In 2020, a team led by Lynn Wadley of the University of the Witwatersrand, publishing in Science, reported the discovery of grass bedding at Border Cave, dated to at least 200,000 years old, pushing back the earliest known evidence of constructed bedding by more than 100,000 years over the previous record itself, from the nearby South African site of Sibudu. The bedding was identified through scanning electron microscopy and infrared spectroscopy on white flecks in the sediment, which turned out to be fossilized fragments of broad-leafed grass, laid down in layers across a bed of ash, roughly a foot thick in places. The ash was not incidental. Wadley's team identified traces of Tarchonanthus, camphor bush, mixed into the topmost layer of the oldest bedding, a plant still used today by communities in rural East Africa as an aerial insect repellent. The layering pattern across the site sequence shows the same behavior repeating for tens of thousands of years. Grass laid fresh, periodically burned to clean the surface and destroy pests, and replaced with new material laid over the resulting ash. Stone tool debris, burned bone, and small rounded grains of red and orange ochre, found mixed into the bedding, indicate the surface was used for working as well as sleeping. with the ochre likely transferred from human skin or from pigmented objects handled there. This is a level of planned, repeated, delayed gratification behavior. Understanding that a pest problem tomorrow can be solved by an action taken today that had not previously been documented this early in the human record anywhere. Separately, charred underground storage organs recovered from layers dated to around 170,000 years ago represent oldest known evidence of cooked starchy rhizomes, showing the cave's occupants were processing plant food with fire deep into the Middle Stone Age. Bohr Cave has also yielded skeletal remains from at least 8 anatomically modern individuals across its sequence, along with marine shell ornaments carried inland from a coastline many kilometers away, and what has been described as the oldest known burial associated with a personal ornament. None of this required a crisis to explain it. It required a landscape at the southeastern edge of the African interior, stable and resource-rich enough that a population could return to the same shelter across 200,000 years of shifting African climate through multiple glacial and interglacial swings and keep doing the same things, sleeping clean, cooking roots, working ochre, coming home. The shelter today sits in a nature reserve straddling the international border it is named for. The sediment inside still holds fireplaces stacked directly on top of each other, generations over generation, a domestic hearth used and reused across a span of time longer than the entire span separating us from the last Neanderthal. Number 4. The lake that dried into a desert and kept its people's footprints anyway. Western New South Wales, Australia, is today one of the driest inhabited regions on the continent. 17 dry Pleistocene lake beds, collectively the Willandra Lakes, sit across an arid landscape most visitors would call desert. For tens of thousands of years, several of these lakes, fed by an ancient channel of the Lachlan River, held water instead. Lake Mungo is the smallest and the most famous of them. In July 1968, geologist Jim Bowler was surveying the eroded dune formations, or lunettes, along the lake's edge when he found bone fragments emerging from the sediment. The remains belonged to a young woman, cremated, her burnt bones deliberately smashed and buried, in what is now recognized as the oldest known evidence of ritual cremation anywhere in the world. She is known as Mungo Lady. In February 1974, Bowler returned to the same lunette and found a second individual nearby, an adult male, buried with his hands crossed over his lap, his body sprinkled with red ochre carried in from an outcrop well beyond walking distance of the site. He is known as Mungo Man. Both have been dated to at least 40,000 years old, with some estimates placing Mungo Man closer to 42,000. The dates rewrote the accepted timeline for human presence in Australia, which at the time held the continent was occupied only from around 20,000 years ago. They also demonstrated something specific to this landscape. The Willandra Lakes were not marginal ground at the edge of an occupied continent. For long periods between roughly 50,000 and 15,000 years ago, while the lakes were full, they were rich ground, hospitable enough to draw people to their shores and support a stable population there for tens of thousands of years. Even as much of interior Australia during the same period was becoming increasingly arid and difficult to survive in. Further discoveries followed. In 2003, researchers uncovered a set of trackways preserved in the lunette clay, dated to roughly 20,000 years ago, showing dozens of individual footprints, adults and children moving together across the wet lakeshore mud, in some places clearly running. Middens throughout the lunettes hold shellfish, fish, and yabbies, evidence of a diet drawn directly from the lake itself. Megafauna, including Zygomaturus, a hippo-sized wombat relative, grazed the lake margins until the water began its final retreat, around 10 to 14,000 years ago, at the close of the last glacial cycle. What Willandra represents is a refuge inside a refuge. Sahul, the combined Pleistocene landmass of Australia and New Guinea, was itself the destination of one of the longest ocean-crossing migrations early modern humans ever undertook. Once inside that continent, as its interior dried and contracted through glacial cycles, a scattering of permanent water sources, this system of lakes among them, became the difference between a viable homeland and an empty one. Following consultation with the Pakanji, Ngiyampa, and Muthi Muthi peoples, whose traditional lands include the Willandra. The Australian government approved the return of Mungo Lady, Mungo Man, and more than 100 other ancestral remains to the region for reburial. The lake that held them for 40,000 years is dry today, wind moving over cracked clay where deep water once stood. The footprints in the lunette are still there, pressed into ground that has not been wet again since the people who made them last stood on it. Number 3. The bone that carried a continent's ancestry out of a limestone cave outside Beijing. In 2003, quarry work near Zhoukoudian, southwest of Beijing, exposed a fissure cave containing a partial human skeleton. The site, Tianyuan Cave, yielded bones initially studied by Hong Shang and Eric Trinkhaus, who in 2007 described the remains as belonging to an anatomically modern human dated to between roughly 42,000 and 39,000 years old, later refined to approximately 40,000. What made Tianyuan significant was not the skeleton alone. It was what could be pulled out of it a decade later. In 2013, a team led by Qiaomei Fu, working with Matthias Meyer and Svante Pabo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, extracted nuclear and mitochondrial DNA from a leg bone using techniques only recently developed for degraded ancient samples. It was, at the time, the earliest ancient DNA ever recovered from East Asia, and the first genome-wide data from an ancient individual in China at all. The genome showed the Tianyuan individual's proportion of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry was no higher than in people living in the region today, meaning the major episodes of interbreeding between modern humans and archaic populations had already happened, and their signature had already stabilized by 40,000 years ago. A follow-up study led by Fu, published in 2017, sequenced the genome more deeply and found something unexpected: shared genetic signal with a 35,000-year-old individual, designated Goyet Q16-1, from the Goyet Caves in Belgium, more than 7,000 kilometers away. That signal was not found in other ancient Europeans of comparable age, ruling out a simple explanation of direct contact between the two populations. Instead, it points to a shared ancestral population broadly distributed across Eurasia before separating into lineages that would eventually diverge into recognizably European and Asian populations. The Tianyuan individual is not a direct ancestor of living East Asians. The genome shows a population related to, but branching earlier than, the line that leads to people in the region today. Evidence that East Asia held multiple genetically distinct human populations simultaneously in the tens of thousands of years following the migration out of Africa, not a single unbroken line moving smoothly toward the present. The genome carries one further connection. The population diversity captured in a single 40,000-year-old skeleton from a cave outside Beijing is echoed 20,000 years later and thousands of kilometers to the northeast in the population that would cross into a then unpopulated set of continents. The same broad East Asian ancestral cluster that Tianyuan belongs to would, over the following millennia, contribute lineages that moved north into Siberia and eventually into the Americas. Tianyuan Cave itself was fully excavated and its contents removed for study. The site today exists mainly as a research reference point, rather than a place to visit. What remains extraordinary is what an ordinary limestone fissure preserved. Not a monument, not a painted wall, just a leg bone, cold and mineral for 40,000 years, that turned out to hold a readable fragment of the entire population history of a continent. Number 2. The rainforest that never stopped being occupied, Sarawak on the island of Borneo, holds a limestone massif riddled with caverns near the South China Sea, encompassing some 26 acres of interconnected chambers. The largest opening, known as the West Mouth, has been excavated on and off since the 1950s, when Tom and Barbara Harrison, curators of the Sarawak Museum, ran seasons of fieldwork there. In February 1958, in a trench their crew nicknamed Hell Trench for its heat and humidity, they uncovered a fragmented human skull nearly 3 meters below the modern cave floor. It became known as the Deep Skull. Charcoal recovered near the skull's find spot in 1957 gave an early radiocarbon date around 40,000 years old. A renewed excavation program, beginning in 2000, led by Graham Barker, revisited the stratigraphy with modern methods and refined the date to between roughly 40,000 and 34,000 years ago, while showing that cultural material at the site, worked stone and traces of activity, extended back further still to around 46,000 years ago. A 2016 reassessment of the skull itself, led by Darren Curnow and colleagues, revised the individual's likely age at death and sex, concluding it more probably belonged to an older female than the adolescent male originally proposed by Don Brothwell's 1960 analysis, and affirmed the skull as most likely representing an early population that had spread from mainland East Asia. In 2018, further excavation in a nearby chamber called Trader Cave, part of the same complex, recovered microlithic stone tools dated to roughly 65,000 years old and a second human skull dated to around 55,000 years, making Trader Cave the oldest known archaeological site with human remains in Malaysia, and pushing the earliest known human presence in Borneo back significantly beyond the deep skull's own date. What makes Niah unusual is the environment those dates sit inside. At the time of the earliest occupation, sea levels during glacial phases had exposed the shallow Sunda Shelf, joining Borneo to the Southeast Asian mainland as part of a single vast landmass, Sundaland. People reaching Niah were not arriving on an island. They were walking across dry, low-lying, at times swampy terrain that has been almost entirely swallowed by the sea since. And once they arrived, in a dense equatorial rainforest environment, long assumed by earlier researchers to be too resource-poor and too difficult to sustain hunter-gatherer populations, they stayed. Excavations at Niah document evidence of human activity spanning most of the last 45,000 years, an occupation record covering the entire span from the depths of the last glacial cycle, through its coldest phase, into the warm world that followed. That persistence has forced a rewrite of assumptions about tropical rainforest as marginal habitat. It was not marginal to the people using it. It was home, continuously, across a span of time longer than the gap separating the invention of agriculture from the present day. Roughly 94% of the old Sunda landmass that once connected Niah to the Asian mainland now lies underwater, drowned as the ice sheets melted, and global sea level rose by more than 100 meters. The rainforest karst above the cave still stands, dense and green, an hour's climb through humidity, cobras, and crocodile-holding rivers from the nearest access point. Inside, 3 meters down, is where the deep skull lay for 40,000 years, in a landscape that used to be a continent's edge and is now an island's coast. Number 1. The painting older than the migration it may have witnessed, on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, in the limestone karst region of Maros Pangkep, a cave called Liang Tadonge holds a painting of a Sulawesi warty pig, a stocky wild boar native to the island and nowhere else. In 2019, a team led by Adam Brum and Maxime Aubert used uranium series dating on a thin mineral crust that had formed directly on top of the pigment, a technique that measures a minimum age for the art beneath it. The result, published in Science Advances in 2021, was 45,500 years. At the time, it was the oldest dated figurative artwork known anywhere on Earth. A related panel in a nearby cave, Leong Bulu Sepong 4, shows something more complex. A hunting scene roughly 4.5 meters wide, depicting human-like figures, some carrying spears or ropes, confronting Sulawesi warty pigs and dwarf buffalo. Some of the human-like figures show features suggesting therianthropes, hybrid beings part human and part animal, the earliest known example of imaginative, rather than purely representational, storytelling and art anywhere in the world. Originally dated to a minimum of 43,900 years, that scene was redated in 2024 by a team led by Adi Agus Octaviana and Maxime Aubert, publishing in Nature, using a new laser ablation uranium series imaging technique with far finer spatial resolution than the earlier method. The new minimum age, 50,200 years. In the same study, a newly identified panel at a third cave, Liang Karampuang, depicting human-like figures interacting with a pig, returned a minimum age of 51,200 years, making it, at the time of publication, the oldest known surviving example of a pictorial narrative anywhere on the planet. Every time this cave system has been dated more precisely, the paintings have gotten older. The location is not incidental to the age. Sulawesi sits in Wallacea, the belt of oceanic islands between the Asian mainland shelf, Sunda, and the Australian New Guinea shelf, Sahul, that has never, even at the lowest glacial sea levels, been connected by dry land to either. Modern humans reaching Sulawesi had to cross open water to get there, and current models of the human settlement of Sahul treat this island as one of the likely stepping stones on the route east, the launching point for further ocean crossings that eventually reached Australia and New Guinea by at least 65,000 and possibly close to 70,000 years ago. That means the painters at Leong Karampuang, working at minimum 200 years ago, were creating this art on an island that functioned as a waypoint in the very crossing that populated an entire continent, at a date not far removed from the crossing itself. The choice of subject reinforces the connection to place, not an abstract pattern, not a lost symbol, but the actual animal living in the actual forest around the cave mouth, rendered by someone who had watched it closely enough to catch its build, its bristled back, its stance. Sulawesi is the largest island in Wallasa, roughly 174,000 square kilometers, and its archaeological record stretches back to Middle Pleistocene stone tools associated with extinct megafauna at a site called Telepu, long before modern humans arrived at all. But it is the paintings that carry the clearest signal of what this island refuge, this scatter of habitable land between two continents, made possible. A resting point stable enough, resource-rich enough, and lived in long enough that the people crossing it stopped, more than 50,000 years ago, and left a record not of survival alone, but of what they saw and what they imagined while they were here. The calcium carbonate crust that dated the Leong Karampuang painting is still growing over it today, the same slow mineral process that has protected the image for 51,000 years, continuing to seal it further from the air. Every recalibration of the dating method has pushed the number back further. Nobody currently working in that cave expects the number now published to be the last one. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.